Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us on the webinar today, Promoting a Diverse and Inclusive Workplace by Understanding Personality. My name's Tom Leary and I'm a Key Account Manager at the Myers-Briggs company. I'll be assisting with questions and comments throughout the webinar today. Due to the large number of participants, we will keep everyone on mute just to avoid any background noise. So please use the question box feature on your GoToWebinar panel to provide feedback and to ask any questions. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly introduce you to the Myers-Briggs company. Our mission is to inspire everyone to lead more successful and fulfilling lives. We deliver on our mission through various approaches: our consulting solutions, research services, certification training, and through our range of assessments. Our goal is to maximize the performance of leaders, teams, and organizations through the use of our psychometric tools and professional services. Sharing our expertise is also part of what we do as a certified B Corporation, which is a movement we're incredibly proud to be a part of. Being a B Corp is about putting a focus on our environment, people, and the community around us as part of everything we do. It's a fairly new concept, but one that's gaining huge momentum, particularly in the Asia Pacific region, and we encourage you to learn more about it. Today's webinar will run for about an hour and will be facilitated by Dr. Martin Bolt, Senior Director of Professional Services and Psychologist at the Myers-Briggs company. Martin has extensive experience working with organisations across the Asia-Pacific region in areas including team effectiveness and executive leadership development, organisational change, virtual training solutions, workplace wellbeing, and resilience. Martin's also our lead assessment certification trainer. Today, Martin will be sharing research highlighting how undervaluing particular aspects of personality can contribute to a lack of diversity and inclusion at senior levels in organisations. He'll also discuss steps that organisations can take. And with that, I'll turn over to you, Martin.
Great, thanks, Tom. And welcome everyone who's joined our session today. And I can see that it's of great interest given the number of people who registered for our webinar and also who are joining. And I should make a point that we're going to invite you to participate in our webcast today. So please be ready to respond to some questions Tom and I will be posing to you. And we're very interested in getting everyone's perspectives on the things we're looking at. And what we're covering today, I believe, is very important as we'll look at how personality is often an overlooked aspect of diversity and inclusion, and also how it may influence a lack of diversity we're seeing in different areas of work. So the words diversity and inclusion are being increasingly used in the workplace and wider society. I know that I see it quite often in publications and headlines. But when I actually ask or look at what people mean by diversity and inclusion, there's not always a consistent meaning. So to set the scene for what we're looking at today, I thought it important to establish what diversity and inclusion means as defined by the Diversity Council of Australia. So if we start with diversity, it's where we're having a mix of people, mixed based on ethnicity, age, gender, education, or even professional backgrounds, in a workplace. And then when we look at inclusion, it's when diversity of people is respected, connected, and contributing to organizational success. So there is a real relevance of how diversity and inclusion work together. It's one thing to have a diverse workforce, but if there's not inclusion, then you lose the benefits of that diversity. So with those two, I guess, definitions in mind, here's your chance to participate in our session today. And we're going to launch a poll on this. So I'll ask everyone to be ready to respond to our poll. And what we're going to ask you to think about from your experience is, my workplace actively supports diversity and inclusion. So Tom, I think if the poll's ready, you're welcome to open that. And if everyone could just take a moment to respond whether you agree with that statement, whether you're unsure, or whether you in fact disagree. And again, maybe reflect on if your actual current workplace, whether you agree or disagree this is the case, or if you're not working within an organisation, maybe respond from the basis of the last organisation you were part of, or indeed you might be working with client organisations, and how much you think diversity and inclusion is actively supported. So I might just check in with Tom to see if results are coming in on the poll yet. Have we got any results there yet, Tom?
Yeah, we do, Martin. And as you can see, we've got 79% of people who agree, 17% who are unsure, and then 4% who disagree. So how does that fit in with the research?
Yeah, that's great. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for contributing to the poll and getting involved early on. So in actual fact, we'll see that what you've shared today is pretty in keeping with some recent research that's been undertaken. So this is Australian research, and a study by the Diversity Council of Australia found that an overwhelming majority of Australians, in this study, in actual fact, 78%, either support or strongly support having a diverse and inclusive workplace, which is very reassuring. And just looking at our poll today, very consistent with what we're seeing. So I guess it's also notable there. You can see from that survey that 19% of people in the sample neither support nor oppose having a diverse or inclusive workplace. And you can also see there's 3% who actually oppose it. So I guess more investigation needs to be undertaken to understand people's views on this. But while this survey indicates that the majority of people want a diverse and inclusive workplace, is that actually playing out in reality when we look at what we're all encountering in the workplace? So if we look at senior leaders, and most are white and male, if you type in CEO into an image library, as I did when I was putting this presentation together, this is the sort of image you get, a white man wearing a suit. And if you look at publicly available statistics, you get pretty much the same message. For example, at the start of 2020, there were more CEOs of the S&P 100 companies that were named John than there were women CEOs. And there were more directors named John or Robert or William or James than all the women directors of these companies. And this is despite the fact that companies with women on the board are actually being found to perform better. So if we take it a step further, in June 2020, there were only 5 CEOs that were Black from the Fortune 500 companies. And at the moment, the effects of the COVID pandemic may be making things worse. So what we're seeing from research about COVID is it's showing that older people are more likely to be affected by COVID than younger, men affected more than women, minority groups affected more than majority groups, and people on lower incomes are worse off than those on higher incomes. And this is likely to be increasing the amount of inequality in the workplace. So women and people from ethnic minority groups are more likely than others to be in jobs where they aren't able to work from home, and so are more likely to have been stood down or even made redundant. And they're also more likely to be frontline workers facing the possibility of long-term effects on their health and then obviously career prospects. Also, for many parts of the world, including here locally, but also now increasingly more again overseas, schools are being closed, and women also have taken on a bigger share of childcare than men as kids are being homeschooled, and mothers are more likely to have left their jobs or even been made redundant. So mothers who are working from home are reporting that they have less time to spend on work than their partners, and often more interrupted again and again by the kids being at home, which is then having an impact on their careers. And in doing research from our company that we're carrying out, we're finding that women are significantly more concerned than men about having children at home for extended periods of time, and are finding it more difficult to remain focused while working from home. And I can testify that that was the experience in our household when we had homeschooling as well. And other research has shown that women from minority ethnic groups have been even more severely affected by the pandemic than women from majority ethnic groups in the population. So today I'm going to try to bring a little light into this what might appear very bleak and dark picture. And we'll start off by looking at research that we've carried out that demonstrates an ongoing lack of diversity, particularly in leadership roles in organisations, but also how personality type, or rather organisational attitudes to particular types, can affect this lack of diversity or maybe even make it worse. Then we'll show you how you can use this information to help make things fairer, with some specific actions that you and organisations can take to address diversity and inclusion. And finally, we'll remind you about some of the tools and resources that you can use following our webinar, and some things that we're going to share with those who've joined our session today. So let's start off by looking at the research project that our company's been undertaking. And what we did is looked at everyone who had undertaken the Myers-Briggs type indicator personality questionnaire between the years of 2004 and 2018. And the group of people who completed the questionnaire also were sharing with us their gender and ethnicity and job roles. So let's have a look at the sample. First of all, it's a nice big sample of nearly 1.8 million people, roughly half male and female. And just under a third of people were in the sample came from minority ethnic backgrounds. And again, the ethnicity categories that are being used here were tabulated by our research team in the US. So they were using terminology that is typically used in their local research. And we also asked people to identify what job levels they were working in. And so, for example, even though executives and top executives only made up 2.4% of our sample, that still constitutes 42,000 people. So it's a decent size that we're looking at there. So what did we actually find from this study? Well, the next few slides, I'm giving everyone a warning. There is going to be some numbers and a lot of numbers, but I'll talk us through so we can see what's the picture in the numbers. So you can probably tell from the title of this slide what the overall result of the research is, but let's look at the evidence. So here we have the percentage of the sample at each job level, from entry level all the way to the executive or top executive roles. And here we have the percentage of this, these are the same figures that you saw on the previous slide. So for example, 2.4% of the group are at the executive level and 8.1% are at the senior management level. So if we add 2.4 and 8.1 together, we get what constitutes the senior leaders of organisations. And that's 10.5% of the group are in executive or senior management roles. But if we look at men and women separately, you can actually see that 3.3% of men are in executive roles and 10.1% in senior management roles. So in total, 13%. When we look at women, only 8% of women cover the top two levels of organisations. And at the other end of the jobs ladder, you can actually see 53% or more than half of women are in below management level roles. In comparison, 45% of men make up less than half of that below management level roles. So women are underrepresented at more senior levels. And for those of you who like stats or checking how meaningful this is from a statistical point of view, these differences between men and women job level were found to be statistically significant. Now, what does this mean when we look at majority and minority ethnic groups in terms of job level? Well, 11% of people from the majority ethnic group were reaching executive or senior management roles. In comparison, only 8% of people from minority ethnic groups. And again, looking at the other levels, 53% of people from minority groups made up job roles below management, whereas 45% of people from majority groups were in the non-management roles. So minority individuals are very underrepresented at senior levels. And again, this result was also statistically significant. So these are not chance outcomes. So given these figures, it's probably no surprise to find that women from minority groups, and when we're talking about minority groups, we're typically referring to people from Black, Asian, or minority ethnicity groups in the population, are especially underrepresented. So just over 14% of people from the majority group who were men reach executive and senior management levels, but less than 6% of people who are women and from minority groups reach those senior levels in an organisation. Whereas almost 60% of women from minority groups are found to be working in non-supervisory or entry-level roles. And if we compare that with men from the majority group, that's again a much higher proportion than the majority group. Now, this situation, I guess, probably looks pretty bleak in terms of diversity, but remember, this is actually data from 2004 to 2018. So perhaps things are getting better. So this graph will show the degree of underrepresentation of women at executive and senior management levels year by year. So this is something we wanted to see if things were changing over time. And what we've done is we've divided the actual number of women at each level with what you would expect by chance if women were fairly represented, given the total number of men and women in the sample and the total number at each level. So percentages below 100 on this chart, which is the line of equal representation, means women are underrepresented. Or a percentages above 100 would show that they're overrepresented. So essentially, if women are equally represented, we'd expect the result to be up near 100%. So in 2004, what we actually found is 56% of the number of women you might expect to make it to executive level, and only 67% of women that you might expect to make it to senior management level were represented. So clearly underrepresented. And over the last 15 years, there's been a bit of an improvement. There's been a gradual increase in the representation of women. But as you can see from the chart here, there is still a big gap, especially at the executive level. And even if these trends continue in a straight line, then women might be fairly represented amongst senior managers at the earliest by the 2030s, and for executive level roles to be equally represented by 2070, which is 50 years from now. Now, I guess if we were able to look into the future, it might be even a bit too optimistic to assume that there'd be that equal representation even more than 50 years from now. So based on this data, women are less likely to achieve fair representation in the executive level of organisations, even in this century. And minority groups are also underrepresented at senior levels. But the trend here isn't so clear, and we're actually really not sure why there's this dip in and then a recovery over recent years. But again, it doesn't look like we're heading for equality anytime soon when it comes to representation of minority ethnic groups in senior leadership roles. So there's a lot to digest in terms of the stats and numbers there, but so far we've been looking at diversity relating to gender and ethnicity, and like age and sometimes even work roles, which are other aspects of diversity, these tend to be the more visible aspects of diversity. And when I say visible, we tend to be able to see and notice things like gender, ethnicity, and age. And even if our perceptions about particular groups are not entirely accurate, it's still something that's very visible. And more organisations today are working to improve on this lack of visible diversity. However, not all forms of diversity are easily visible. A less visible aspect of diversity are our underlying personality types. As research and experience consistently shows, our personality influences our view of the world and how we make decisions, and it can be easily overlooked by diversity and inclusion initiatives in organisations. So the MBTI personality type framework provides a validated and objective way of understanding the diversity of personality types and what each type can contribute in the workplace. So here's another chance to get involved and participate in our session today. Let's see how many people who are joining us today actually know their MBTI type. So if you have completed the MBTI assessment and been through the debriefing or verification process and found your best fit type, what we're going to do is ask you to share your 4-letter type in the question box in a minute. And then shortly I'll ask Tom to let us know the diversity of types we have joining our webinar today. So if you're ready now and you know your type, please go ahead and share it in the question box so we can start to see what sort of personality types we've got represented in our audience today. And while we're capturing these types, it will help to define some of the MBTI preferences, as workplace research is actually using the MBTI to help understand how personality type relates to inequalities found in the workplace. But looking at the preferences that the MBTI assessment measures. So those who might be already familiar with this theory and framework, you'll be aware there are 4 pairs of preferences that the MBTI measures. The first pair of preferences is extroversion, introversion, how we prefer to direct and receive our mental energy. Sensing and intuition looks at how we prefer to take in information. Thinking and feeling looks at how we prefer to decide and come to conclusions. And judging and perceiving, how we prefer to approach the outside world. And what's important to keep in mind is that all people use all 8 of these preferences. But in each pair, we're predisposed or inclined to prefer one approach more than the other, which then results in our underlying personality type. So I might ask Tom now if you could maybe just check in with to see what sort of MBTI types people are sharing with us today.
Yeah, sure, Martin. We've got quite a few responses here. So just looking through ISFJ, ENFJ, ENFP, INFP, ISTJ, INFJ, ENTJ. Yeah, it looks like we've got people from across the 16 different types who are joining us on the webinar today.
Excellent. Well, that's great. Well, I guess it reinforces that even the topic of this session has relevance for people of all different personality types, which I'm not surprised about. But great to see that we've got quite a diverse representation of personality types on our session today. Now, what we'll see shortly is it's actually the 2 middle preference pairs that are particularly relevant to diversity issues or in the workplace. So that's the pairs of sensing and intuition and thinking and feeling. Now, if we look at the data from our 1.8 million people who've completed the MBTI assessment, we can see that people with some type preferences are more likely to make it into senior level roles in the organisations than other type preferences. So for people at the top level, are a little more likely to have preferences for extroversion. So that's the orange bars represented on the screen, in comparison to people who prefer introversion. However, there's actually not a huge difference between extroverts and introverts when we're looking at these senior leadership roles. But when we look at the next pair of preferences, senior managers are definitely more likely to have preferences for intuition. This is the yellow bars. And you can see as we get to the senior management and executive levels, there's a higher proportion of those preferring intuition. And then we go to the next pair of preferences, another clear trend starts to emerge, and that is those who prefer thinking are more likely to be represented in the senior levels of management. And with our last pair of preferences, we didn't actually find much difference there by job level. So there's not, although there tend to be more J preference people reporting in this sample, it doesn't appear to change much from one level to the next. But the important finding in these personality preference differences is we're seeing here is there is likely to be an impact on diversity because thinking and feeling has an interaction with gender, and sensing and intuition interacts with majority and minority ethnicity differences. So let's see how that works. Here are the figures for men and women who reported with a thinking preference. And if you look at the male column, you'll see that men at higher levels are more likely to have a thinking preference than men at lower levels. And the same goes for women in the sample. Women at higher levels are more likely to have a thinking preference than women at lower levels of job authority in organisations. But if you compare the two columns, there is a difference. At any level, men are more likely to have a thinking preference than women. In fact, even at entry-level roles, male employees are more likely to have a thinking preference than women executives. So this appears to be pointing to that there's value that organisations seem to place on objective thinking decision-making style. And this could mean that women leaders are taken less seriously in a number of organisations. There is some good evidence actually that a relationship or values-based way of making decisions, which is typical of people with the feeling preference, helps to create an effective transformational leadership style. But there is also some other research evidence that people with that kind of approach to leadership can be seen, and I really emphasize it's a perception, not necessarily a fact, but can be seen as less effective in their decision-making in organisations. And there's something else that's hiding in this data, and that is that there is an interaction between occupational level, gender, and decision-making style. So for men, the proportion of people with a thinking preference did not vary much between job levels, just 6.6%. But for women, the percentage varied from 39% at the employee level up to 57% at the top level, 18 percentage points. So this suggests that for women, it may be more difficult to be promoted if you have a feeling preference. But for men, it doesn't seem to matter. All things being equal, men are just as more likely to reach the higher level in an organisation with thinking preference. So the two right-hand columns now focus in on how the MBTI preferences might relate to ethnicity. And you're more likely to have an intuitive preference if you are in the majority ethnic group for the sample, and you're more likely to reach the top if you have an intuitive preference. The difference is not quite as marked for sensing and intuition as it is for thinking, feeling, and gender. But nonetheless, when you compare what's the interaction, there is still a real interaction between those who prefer intuition, more likely to be in senior roles, and also if you are from a majority ethnic group, more likely to be in senior level roles. So what is all this research pointing to, or what is it highlighting for us? Well, first of all, hopefully you can see what's come from those results is that female and minority ethnicity groups are underrepresented in senior levels in organisations. Also, that women from minority ethnic groups are especially underrepresented in leadership and decision-making roles. So that's going to have some effect on how decisions are made in organisations. Representation of women in leadership is still lagging, even though there's been some improvement over recent years. It still lags behind where men are in terms of representation. And there also doesn't appear to be a consistent trend at present for the representation of people from minority groups in leadership, as in it seems to improve, but then we've also seen some dips in representation. And also what I've just been highlighting is there are differences when we look at MBTI preferences with respect to representation. And in particular, the preferences that we use for taking information and decision making may actually exacerbate these diversity issues, particularly for women. And you'll notice that despite these differences, nowhere in this data is there any evidence that people with personality preferences for intuition or thinking in any way make better leaders than, say, people with the opposite preferences for sensing or feeling. So this really highlights another form of lack of diversity in the workplace based on personality preferences. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really a hidden lack of diversity. So what can we actually do about this? So with this knowledge, how can we address the diversity and inclusion gaps in our organisations or for our clients? Well, first of all, we can raise awareness of these issues. So let's not let our organisation or client organisations walk off a precipice just because they don't know about this stuff. So the first thing we can do is share the research. So raising some of these issues pointed out in the research enables decision makers to address blind spots arising from the lack of diversity in the workplace. Our research is recent and it shows there is still a hill to climb to address diversity and inclusion, despite the recent focus on this as a topic in many workplaces. And although there's underrepresentation of women and minority groups, I'm afraid is well known, and probably the reason why a lot of diversity and inclusion development and training is being put in place. The interaction with personality in the workplace and how it relates to diversity and inclusion is not really well understood or even well recognised. So we need to be more aware of what are some of the factors that could be affecting that diversity issues, including the current situation that might be arising for how the COVID pandemic might be disadvantaging certain groups more than others. I've also mentioned several other studies that point out the lack of diversity at the top level, as well as how situations like COVID pandemic could be making things worse. And there has not been time in our session today to go into these in detail, but we do have a list of references that we can share with those who are interested after our webinar today, who want to look more at the detailed research findings from that. And we're also finding that in that research, there is evidence that should appeal to people who are paying attention to the bottom line of organisations. And the evidence, for example, that organisations with women on the board or greater representation of women at the board level have actually been found to perform better. And of course, this may be as much or more to do with the general openness of those organisations to diversity as anything else, or to the idea that to reach the top, women have to try harder in many organisations. And one of the things that I think this research shows is there is a shortage of sensing and feeling personality types in leadership roles. And that may not be good for the way in which organisations approach and solve problems they're consistently facing, including responses to change, employee engagement, and customer satisfaction. So a good tool that I found you can use to illustrate this is something we call the MBTI Z decision-making model. So I do a considerable amount of work these days with senior leadership and executive teams. And in my consulting work with executive management and also operational teams, I have found that using a Z decision-making model, which is based on the MBTI preferences of sensing and intuition and thinking and feeling, enables teams to make well-rounded decisions. So how does it work? In making a decision or solving a problem, we first need to take in information and then to make decisions based on that information. The idea is that we make sure that we use both sensing and intuition to gather the information, and then we use thinking and feeling to make the final decision. So you might, for example, start with sensing, the sensing part of the decision. What does the facts, the data, what's real, what do we actually know, and what can we learn from past experience? So that's what the sensing perspective offers. Then we move to intuition, where we're looking more now at trends and patterns in the facts and data, and also where are we heading in the future? How does everything connect together? What's the big picture here? After looking at it from an intuitive perspective, then we take all that information and weigh up the pros and cons and look to see what the objectively right answer or right approach would be using the thinking preference. So it's a bit like doing a pros and cons analysis. And then the final element as part of our decision is to think about how this decision will impact on the people involved and how it relates to our values using the feeling preference as part of the decision making. Now, each of us has our own preferences out of these four, and we rely on at least two of them more than the other two. And the same goes for managers, executives, and CEOs. And if, as when we've seen from the data, many leaders of organizations, or the majority, are likely to have preferences for intuition and thinking, all the other aspects or important aspects relating to sensing and feeling might actually get overlooked or even ignored. So I recently assisted an executive team using this Z decision-making approach to identify blind spots in their group decisions. And similar to the research, this team that I was working with were very commercially driven and in fact very successful on that measure, but were starting to lose long-standing customers and also staff to competitors. So by taking them through a series of decisions that they made, and then also starting off with inviting each of those executive managers to complete the MBTI assessment and feedback to help them identify their own preferences, we then looked at their collective MBTI profiles as a team. And they identified when making decisions, they focused predominantly on the thinking part of the decision process and became aware that they were consistently overlooking the feeling impact of their decisions in the Z model. So when working with that team, here were some of the questions that I guided them to use in their decisions to ensure they didn't overlook crucial aspects of an outcome or a decision. And in fact, what was notable is one of the managers in the team said, feeling is our team's Achilles heel, and our business is not going to be able to run like an Olympian if we keep overlooking this. And I thought that was a really salient comment in the moment. Fortunately, they have been able to improve things by being more conscious and deliberate about looking at decisions from their less preferred and less represented MBTI preferences in the team, which has actually resulted in increased commitment and buy-in to their decisions from staff. So if we can help people to understand the importance of diversity of personality, this opens the door to an understanding of the importance and advantages of other forms of diversity too. And it starts to build a more inclusive view of the world. And one of the advantages of having diversity, particularly of personality and other forms too, is that it could act as a counter to what we're all probably familiar with, groupthink. The tendency for a group where everybody is to say the same or to think the same, or to ignore data or opinions that run against the line of thinking put forward by the majority of the group. So where people with different ideas or who are planning to head in different directions, like the rubber duck on the slide here, are ignored, we end up with groupthink. And there are numerous well-documented situations through history where groupthink has not only led to business failures, but also tragically loss of life. And now at the current time, when we're faced with a world that's in a period of disruption or potentially crisis, and when organizations are faced with things like drops in sales or revenue, or there may be fewer staff trying to do the same amount of work and other problems because of the recession or COVID, when we're just desperately trying to keep the lights on and stay afloat, well, perhaps it's actually tempting to behave in a very consistent or to fall in line with the rest of the group, to pull together in the same direction, when really that runs the risk of groupthink occurring, and nothing could be further from the truth about all pulling in the one direction. In fact, now is probably the time more than ever where it's important for organizations to have diversity of people, diversity of perspectives and thinking, and to also build more diversity into the attitudes of how organizations are functioning. And another important factor when we think about diversity and how it might be impacted, and every person I find is at risk of this factor, the be like me factor, BLM. If you've not heard of this before, it's a psychological bias to admire or to like people who share similar characteristics or background or even personality to ourselves. It's just something that is very instinctual or natural for humans to look for familiarity or similarity and feel comfortable with that. But the be like me factor is known to result in biased decisions in the workplace, including who is recruited, who's promoted, or even who gets offered development opportunities and who's overlooked for development opportunities. So while the be like me factor can result in a lack of diversity, there is a known way to counteract this effect. And one of the best ways to avoid groupthink or the be like me factor is to increase self-awareness, particularly of leaders and their teams. Now, leaders can appreciate their own strengths and limitations by having greater self-awareness and start to see the value of other people's views. And there's quite a lot of evidence that men generally have a more inflated view of their own abilities in comparison to women. So this can have quite a direct effect on diversity just in itself. But it actually goes beyond this. Using assessments like the MBTI are a great way for helping people to understand themselves, but also how they differ from other people, and understanding the value of differences and how we can use them in a positive, creative, and constructive way. And also understanding the importance and the utility of diversity of personality is a stepping stone in appreciating the importance of all forms of diversity. So we have positive reasons, not groupthink reasons, for embracing diversity. And I guess we need to be reminded of just sometimes the lack of diversity that might be in front of us. While much of what I've been sharing with you today relates to the MBTI framework, there is actually good reasons for this. After all, the MBTI assessment was developed by two women, a mother and daughter combination, and their development and work on the MBTI started during World War II, when women were able to take on jobs and taste freedoms that just hadn't been the case before. But in addition to the MBTI, there are many other assessment frameworks and tools that play a part in promoting diversity and inclusion. Another tool that we use and quite effectively with teams and leaders to build a greater understanding of the value of difference is the FIRO, or otherwise known as the Fundamental Interpersonal Relations Orientation Assessment. And the FIRO looks at what our level of need is in 3 interpersonal need areas. The first area is our need for inclusion. The need, to what extent we feel the need to belong to groups and with others. The next need area is the need for control. It's the level of comfort or the extent to which we take initiative and seek out or put in place structure to make things happen. And the third level of need is the need for affection or intimacy, how close and connected we need or want to be to other people. And the FIRO model helps people measure and identify how much of these 3 needs they express or give to other people and how much they are comfortable receiving, or the wanted need. And what we do know is human beings differ in the extent to which each person needs or wants these 3 areas of interpersonal need. And there is a real interplay between gender stereotypes and these FIRO scales. So what we have seen is a male who is high on expressed control. That is a person who likes to set the agenda, get things organized and have a clear structure. In many situations in the workplace will be viewed as assertive or in control. Whereas women with the same level of control need as a male might be described or viewed as bossy and not necessarily assertive. That's one of the reasons why in a business context, we might use names at the bottom of the screen to describe these interpersonal needs. So involvement, influence, and connection. And I've seen that the FIRO can help people, particularly those working with each other, see how their behavior is shaped, not just by society. For example, some men have medium and wanted affection. They want to receive it from other people, but actually have low expressed affection. They don't give much affection in order to receive it. So they may want more intimacy than they show others and wonder why more people don't seem to want to connect at a deeper level with them. So the FIRO can delve very deeply and raise awareness of how these differences between people can be misunderstood or even reinforce a lack of diversity. And another model that I found quite useful in building greater awareness and use of different approaches and diversity and inclusion is the TKI conflict modes assessment. And it looks at how we typically approach conflict. So there are 2 dimensions it enables us to evaluate our needs around. The first is the level of cooperation. To what extent do we feel a need or an underlying desire to be cooperative with other people? And we know that differs from person to person. The other dimension it looks at is to what extent do I need to be assertive or want to be assertive? That is, satisfying my own needs. So all of us have our own set point or natural position of where we fit on those 2 continuums. And what the TKI measures or helps us identify is 5 possible ways of dealing with conflict: competing, collaborating, compromising, avoiding, and accommodating. And whilst we may use all 5, each person is more inclined or predisposed to use one or more of these approaches as a default method when dealing with conflict. And what we found, which was interesting, is research conducted by a company recently found a number of gender differences, particularly with respect to the conflict mode of competing. So men, and especially senior level roles in organizations, are significantly more likely to adopt a competitive style than women. Competing is about power and winning at all costs in a conflict or a negotiation, and never mind what the other person wants or needs. Now, whilst there might be times that's relevant, if that's the only style that's used, it can actually be ineffective. And all things being equal, this will tend to put women at a disadvantage when it comes to negotiating and likely contributes to the gender pay gap that we see in many workplaces. But once people know their usual or default conflict mode, they can learn to use a different one when appropriate. So, for example, in a pay or a negotiation setting, both parties might be more aware of what their natural approach to dealing with conflict is and how to adjust as needed. So other personality assessments, therefore, can help promote diversity, and we've included some information in the notes of our webinar today about the FIRO and the TKI if you have more interest in those. So let's recap what we've been talking about, both in terms of research and where we are now, and also some actions that any one of us can undertake. So the research evidence I'm hoping you're seeing today is pretty clear. That is, females or women and people from minority groups are underrepresented in senior leadership roles in organisations, but especially minority women. On current trends, it's going to take some time, probably years, to get any kind of equal representation. And also, hopefully you're more aware of the role of and the impact of differences in personality preferences, particularly relating to the sensing, intuition, thinking and feeling, and how that could be exacerbating the effects that we're seeing in diversity. So we can raise awareness of this and similar research, but also put it in context. So how COVID is making things worse is worth keeping in mind, and how organisations are missing out on talent by making things more difficult for women or minority groups, and also people of certain personality type preferences, such as sensing and feeling, and by ignoring these different aspects of personality can ultimately lead to more or reinforcing groupthink. So we can use practical tools like the Z decision making model that I was showing before, and others that you'll find in our resources that we provide to those who are practitioners with those tools and also our consulting clients. And these methods bring these issues to life and show the utility of diversity, as well as the ethical basis of being more diverse and inclusive. And above all, we can build self-awareness in our leaders so that they increase their understanding of the positive aspects and value of difference and diversity in others. So I hope that's given you some useful, tangible information and insights to take away or to take forward to share with others. And I'll hand back to Tom now, because he'll also share some things with you that you can take from our session today. So back to you, Tom.
Thank you, Martin, and thanks to everyone for joining us on the webinar today. We will be taking some questions shortly, and these can be submitted through the question box on your GoToWebinar side panel. But now I'll take a few moments to share some more information about our offerings. So for those of you that are new to the Myers-Briggs company, we work with our clients in a few different ways. If you want us to take the lead, we offer consulting services where one of our experienced trainers, such as Martin, can get to know your organisation and design and deliver a customised solution to meet your business requirements. If you want us to work with you, we can partner with you and be as involved in your projects as you want us to be, whether that be co-facilitating or helping you behind the scenes with designing your workshops. If you want us to help you upskill, enabling you to manage all aspects of design and delivery, you can join our certification programs to gain the knowledge and tools you need to build that capability internally. We're most well known for the Myers-Briggs type indicator, but we do have a range of tools to support the entire talent lifecycle, including emotional intelligence, leadership 360s, and talent selection tools. If you want more information about our assessments and services, our website is a great place to start. And as Martin mentioned before, there is a handout section in the GoToWebinar side panel where you can download information regarding the assessments mentioned in this webinar. That is the MBTI, the FIRO, and the TKI. I would also like to call special attention to our new web pages with resources for developing your virtual workforce. From our homepage, you can click the first banner, which looks like the one you can see on the screen, to navigate to the virtual workforce pages, which include complementary resources such as tip sheets, quick guides, infographics, and information on virtual team building workshops. These workshops are the MBTI Virtual Insight Workshop Series. We've found that the topics of building resilience, managing change, enhancing communication, and developing a growth mindset are some of the key topics that people are asking us about right now. The workshops are short, focused, virtual sessions that can keep your remote employees engaged through personality insights and practical applications. During the workshops, each participant receives group feedback from our expert consultancy team so that they can find out their Myers-Briggs personality type. Please contact us for further information or to make a booking. Becoming an accredited MBTI practitioner can enable you to deliver your own MBTI workshops, and we do have one final virtual program remaining this year. That program will be held on November 16 to 17, and again, November 19 to 20. So please contact us if you would like to enroll. The 2021 training dates are going to be released in the next couple of weeks, and information about that will then be posted on our website. And finally, we can organise in-house training at a time that suits you. So please contact us if you would like to go down that path. So we'll turn over to questions now, and we have had a number of questions come through. We'll probably get time, looks like we're running out of time, so we'll probably get time for 3 now. And then for everyone else, we will make sure to follow up individually if your question isn't answered. But the first question, Martin, can MBTI, FIRO, and TKI be used for hiring and succession planning to ensure more diverse personality representation in senior roles?
Yeah, I think it's good to be aware that these personality differences, as measured by the MBTI and the FIRO and TKI, are important to understanding the organisational setting, but they don't provide measures of competence or skill in the use of those particular abilities. So no, none of those tools are designed for recruitment or selection. They work best when you have already done your selection or recruitment and you're bringing people together and helping them learn about their different personality needs and what each of their personality approaches bring by way of diversity or different and new perspectives to a team, to a group, or to a leadership approach. So there are other assessments, if people are interested, that are designed for recruitment, hiring, and succession planning that we provide, but the MBTI and FIRO or TKI are not those kind of assessments.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Next question, are these stats, so the stats mentioned earlier in the webinar, are they from a global source or are they specific to local, to our Australian market?
Yeah, also a good question. So it was international samples, but the research was conducted by our US research team, and proportionally, that 1.8 million people, the largest proportion were from North America, but there was European data in there and data from other parts of the world, including Asia Pacific region and Australia, and also parts of South America and the Middle East. So it was international, but acknowledging that a higher proportion of it was from North America.
Okay, thanks, Martin. And this is probably the last question we've got time for. What's the best way to get buy-in to build self-awareness with leaders in the organisation?
Yeah, I wish I had one answer to that, a magic answer. I'm sure that would keep us all occupied. But there's probably multiple methods, but I think the first place to start is people need to be aware that something's not working as well as they think it could or should be, whether it's decisions that are being made by leaders or a leadership group. And I think the example I shared of that executive team that I was working with, they did identify something had changed around customer retention and staff retention. So they were wise enough and I guess motivated enough to want to look at how do we address that. So it's finding, is there something that needs to improve or change, and then really saying, well, the best way of working out how to work with the improvement or changes, first start with how do you approach decisions or issues of change, and building self-awareness is the way to do that. So that's, rather than just saying self-awareness is a nice thing to have, which it is, I find helping individuals or leaders connect with something that's important to them in their role provides the motivation for them to want to learn more about themselves.
All right, thanks again, Martin. And that's probably all we've got time for. So as I mentioned a moment ago, for anyone whose question who wasn't answered, we'll send back an individual response to that in the next week or so. And we will be following up with everyone in the next couple of days with a link to the recording of the session, along with the session notes and the research references that were mentioned. As I said earlier, thanks everyone for attending and enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thank you.